and by you, whose loyalty is more honorable. Given or taken? Osrith pointed to the sleeping girl. Elfwin would have to be protected. She is the most important thing now. Osrith was aware of Aldhelm watching the two of them, and listening, seemingly at a loss as to whether to intervene or not. Ethelred is her father. No matter what you think, Ethelfled protested. What I think is what I know. You confided in me once, Osrith reminded her. And the lady's eyes told her Ethelfled knew. You were pregnant before you ever met Eric. Osrith watched her flinch. Then, Ethelfled leaned past Osrith as if she were no more than a roof pillar and called to her servant. Go to Uhtred, tell him I am here, Ethelfled instructed. But Osrith dashed the note from the maid's surprised fingers. If you want that message delivered, you must find another way. Tell her, for she will not believe me. Osrith said the last part to Aldhelm, who stepped towards Ethelfled and bowed his head. It is true, lady. Uhtred chose to attack your father and, as such, made himself an outlaw to Wessex. Osrith was gratified when she heard an intake of breath from the lady and she leaned closer to Ethelfled. Who can you trust in Winchester? Ethelfled stared at her for a good few minutes, before bending to her desk and writing another letter. When she had finished, the lady sealed it in wax and then wrote another, called her servant to her, bending low to her ear. Very good, my lady, the servant said, accepting the letters, and hurried from the room. Ethelfled then busied herself collecting things that she needed. No time. Osrith shouted, get what you need, and go. If we have been sent to do this to you, Ethelfled, others may be sent to cause harm to your daughter, or ensure we have been successful. Osrith gripped her arm to make her listen when Ethelfled began to shovel papers into bags. Food, blankets, horses. They are crucial. Everything else can wait. Finally, Ethelfled shook Osrith free, and she went to wake up Elfwin. It failed because of me, Aldhelm counselled Osrith as they left Ethelfled to make her plans to flee. That is what we will convey. Me he will forgive. He will kill you. Aldhelm, thank you, Osrith said, and she leaned up to kiss his cheek. He nodded, graciously. As they rode away, as the sun began to rise, Osrith turned to her commander as he said, he needs a purpose. Ethelred. Alfred dictates all the opportunities now. Then perhaps you can suggest this, Osrith replied, and began to explain a possible outlet to keep Ethelred from boredom. When she had finished, she looked across to the serious Aldhelm. So? Osrith asked. What do you think? I think it is a good plan, Osrith. Aldhelm nodded. St. Oswald would certainly bring spirituality back to a broken Mercia. And when Osrith made to go, he made sure he was smiling when she turned round, questioningly. I must ensure she has left safely, then I will catch you up. You are sure of the way? Osrith nodded to a single track road ahead of them. That way? Aldhelm nodded. And so Osrith took the track, which was indeed the correct way back to Oxford, and then Aylesbury. But not the way she took it, for she ended up on a different part of the Fossway, and it wasn't until dusk came that Osrith realized that she must have gone wrong. For there was Watling Street in front of her, which should not be there if she had gone due east. Instead, she must have gone northeast, which meant she was near High Cross again, and close to where she had been, usurping her brother's protection. Uhtred was no longer anywhere near the now, which was very unfortunate for Osrith. 88,888,888. Night fell when Osrith recognized High Cross, the junction where the Fossway and Watling Street met. She had gone the wrong way, that was clear. What was also clear was that it would be foolish to attempt to ride south again, taking the same path as she had done almost a week before. Wherever Uhtred and his men, and the seer was not here. 6 days could take them to Alba. It began to snow. Soft flakes settled around her, and Osrith pulled her cloak about her. She had no food, no shelter, for she and Aldhelm had planned to ride through the night back to Aylesbury. So she would rest here and wait until the morning. A small bourne was springing up just beyond Watling Street and Osrith crossed to it, splashing water into her mouth. She had to hope that Aldhelm had realized she was lost, and intended to return to Aylesbury, rather than just gone off. And the desire to ride south grew so great that she untied her horse's rein and drew the beast round. She had to get there, Fast, Osrith told herself. Water had refreshed her, and doubts had begun to invade her mind. What would Ethelred say when she got back to Aylesbury? What if she got back before Aldhelm? Or after? Osrith swung her leg over her horse and made to start the horse off to trot, his legs slipping under him as he fought for grip on the hard ground. Then a bang to her head was the last thing Osrith knew until she opened her eyes and found herself in a prison cell. 88,888,888. You have to let them in, Utad told his brother. They were standing on the ramparts of Dunham, torches from the gates flickering down towards the men at the gate. It was firmly closed and Ragnar would have it stay that way. We request shelter, Bloodare shouted up. Utad looked to Ragnar, knowing that they were all rivals and yet, all Danes. What are you doing here, Ethelwold? It was more an accusation than a question, when finally Heston and his men were admitted. This army is going south, to capture Wessex, he explained, happily. Who else to be king, than the man who was meant to be king? Utad rolled his eyes and began to stalk towards Dunham's hall. Behind them, a man carried over the prisoner. Why they had captured someone rather than killed them, Ethelwold would never know. Yes, he had a good horse and sword, and a little silver. But why was he needed? Because a Saxon will cause no suspicion when we send him on for us, Heston said, as he shoved the unconscious Osrith into the cell, pulling off her hood. She fell against the floor and lay there. From the other corner, the chained seer, Skade, floated to the bars. I do not wish to be imprisoned with a Saxon, she demanded to Heston. He sniffed, and scratched his hair, before shrugging. I don't care. You will care, when I take your soul and convene with the three spinners. Watch your fate be knitted with that of the world. Ah, she gasped, as she stamped away from the cold gates and huddled down between two hay bales. The better to keep warm. Then, she noticed the Saxon's cloak, and strode over to him, untying it and pulling it over herself. 88,888,888. When Osrith woke up, she was shivering, cold and hungry. Her horse was nowhere. Had she not slept at High Cross? Was she not supposed to be going south? Further inspection of her own person made Osrith begin to panic. No bueno cloak nor the silver she had stolen from Ethelflaed's desk at Saltwick. When she blinked a few more times, Osrith was aware that someone was staring at her. My cloak, Osrith declared, trying to get to her feet. Mine, the woman replied, pulling the thick woolen garment about her shoulders. In her fuzzy state of mind, Osrith tried to get up, but her legs would not hold her, and she stumbled back against the side of the cell. A laugh from outside of the cell made Osrith look outside. A guard was laughing at her incapacity. He spoke to Skade in Danish, and the woman replied, bitten, sharp words, a rebuke of some sort. Osrith figured, for her Danish was not very good. So she was in Daneland then, Osrith thought, with, presumably, Danes. She looked across to the woman again, who was giving Osrith an insolent look. She knew her, of that Osrith was certain. But she could not place her. Osrith sighed. The last time she had been imprisoned with a Dane it had been Eirik Thurgilson, and he was a prisoner too. Your death, Saxon, will be mighty entertaining, Skade tormented. I am an Angle, Osrith corrected her, in Danish. The woman must have been surprised, Osrith thought, for her face froze, surprised at being addressed in Danish by a Saxon. Or Angle. Big difference, Skade shrugged. When they pull you limb from limb for their entertainment it will not matter in the least. But the threats were not going into Osrith's brain. Instead she looked out and into the courtyard of the fortress where she had been brought. Above the ramparts a partial body hung, crows feasting on its synods. You see, Skade said, reading Osrith's actions and implying her thoughts. That will be you tomorrow. Osrith blinked and looked back to the woman again. And where is this, that I will be decorating? We must be north, Dunham. And Osrith stared round again. She was meant to come here, as a child. This would have been her home, when she had been forced to marry Svenk Artanson, by her uncle. Dunham, Osrith thought, in wonder. Then, she shot her head back to the woman, who was eating an apple curled up in Osrith's cloak. Osrith remembered her, the same insolence, the the same arrogance. The seer. You made him ill, Osrith said. Utered. The woman widened her eyes, and stopped eating her apple. And you are the woman who followed him, Skade said. You, but she broke off, for a woman stood before the cell. She was shorter than Osrith and her hair was braided in the Danish way. She seemed not to see Osrith, or else, Osrith was not her concern. The woman glared at Skade, who floated towards the woman. They began to argue in Danish that was too fast for Osrith to understand, which resulted in the brown-haired woman thrusting a staff with a ram's head atop outside the prison. The guard jumped, but that was nothing compared to what the white-haired seer did. Osrith was certain she saw the woman recoil in what looked like a great deal of pain. It was only after the woman began to walk away from the cell that she turned and seemed to notice Osrith. And you are the Saxon stooge, she said to Osrith, disdainfully. I am what? Osrith asked. I do not know how I came to be here. I was riding south, and now you are north, the woman replied, alive, until you have fulfilled your usefulness. And away she went. Osrith sank back to the cold floor, drawing her legs up to her chest. It was cold, and she sat staring at Dunham's tall, straight walls, as if a forest of decapitated trees had been planted in lines to form its walls. Then, after a time, Osrith realized the woman was staring at her. You are no warrior, Skade said, baiting her. A warrior would have fought to gain his cloak back by now. Keep it, Osrith said, and stared out again, feeling a lump in her bindings. The silver coin Finan had given to her as a token of their connection to one another. It was like a promise, like a suggestion of an interest in one another. Osrith held it up in front of her, examining its surfaces. It was an Alfred coin, of course, for he had spent a good deal of his life in Winchester with Utered. But, if she ever got out of Dunham, she would have to give it back to him. Osrith knew she could not promise what the coin suggested. He was not Tagged, who had agreed to let her fight shoulder to shoulder with him. He was Finan, who was bound to her brother by the words of an oath. It was only when she heard laughter before the cell that Osrith looked up. She must have looked a state, and felt very hungry, and she gripped the coin in her hand. Then, before she could protest, Osrith saw the gates of the cell open and two Danes gripped her arms by her shoulders and pulled her to her feet. Excellent, excellent, Heston declared, as he turned Osrith's face to his. Bring him to the hall. In the brighter lights, Osrith blinked. Around her were Danes, many, many Danes, all staring at her, and other people gathered around the central fire pit. Osrith stretched as the warmth infiltrated her muscles, and she was suddenly hungry again. And aware that the many, many Danes were staring at them. There were two other prisoners, one who had clearly wronged one of the leaders. To her horror, and the jubilation of the Danes, the man who had brought her out of the cell pushed the back of one of them. He tumbled into the fire without even a chance to scream, and the pale yellow flames consumed his body. But not all corners of the hall celebrated. A vacuum of sound came from just behind one of the leaders standing next to the brown-haired woman who had argued with the blonde-haired captive. What shocked her most, Osrith realized, was not the death, but the swiftness, and she forced herself to remain calm. In the smoke and acrid smell which, to Osrith, seemed to resemble smoked bacon, she could just make out figures who were not applauding, and she focused her eyes on them. One of them was a Dane. He had long, braided hair and an upper arm bound in silver rings. He was clapping the tall leader on the shoulder and grinning. Beside him, three other men. A fourth was hovering beside the Dane, and was also reticent in celebration. Indeed, he had his arms folded. Take them away, the brown-haired woman's leader shouted. Skoll, he added, raising a wooden cup. The rest greeted them with a skoll. And the men who had dragged Osrith began to grab her arms. Osrith struggled, and kicked out at those men who would be, even now, thinking about throwing her in the fire pit, her heart thumping hard. We have entertainment. The leader who had brought her out approached Osrith and poked her shoulder. We like that, do we not, Saxon bastard? Gale, Osrith corrected, and noticed almost at once a flicker behind the first leader. Someone had moved closer. I am a Gale. Well, Heston said, mockingly, that's almost as good as a Saxon. Hoyt, get your Frisian backside over here and show this Gale what it means to defy the Lord Heston. And Osrith stopped struggling, her heart thumping in her chest, not because Hoyt was so big. She had the advantage of outwitting him, but because she recognized the name. He was the Dane who had robbed Ulf and Gert on the ship, taken the silver she had given them for her passage. She examined Heston's face, wondering if he remembered her too. Sometimes Osrith wondered why she had even tried to bother, knowing what her brother was like, knowing she wasn't going to the ready-made family of her imaginings. "We will make the square," Heston roared, and men around him roared. But not all of them. Osrith noticed. "The Gael can fight the Saxon, and whoever wins can fight my best fighter." Heston clapped the man on the back, as more shouts and roars of encouragement filled the hall. But Osrith noticed the other leader stand more fully upright. "No," Ragnar said, as he stared at Osrith and the other prisoner. "They are more valuable alive, to work for us." This caused booing and roars of objection, and Heston took a step to Ragnar. "How has the great Ragnar Ragnarsson come to be such a bore?" The words were a challenge, but Ragnar did not respond to them. Instead, he stood by the ashes of the fallen prisoner and addressed the Danes at large. "We are one army," he declared. "We are heading south. We go to Wessex to take everything." Ragnar was circling all the warriors now, and clapping them on the back. "We will have time later to celebrate, but I need all of you to advance, as one, south, and then your champion can fight the Gael." He grinned as he took Osrith around the shoulders, raising a fist to hit her. But Osrith was quicker than he expected, and ducked under his arm. "He is quick," Finan remarked to Uhtred, bearded chin resting in hand. "Although I do say that I would not like to witness any more burnings," he added, as the other men met the fate of the first. Heston pulled the men in over the flames, clearing the way for Ragnar and the Gael. "We have entertainment," Heston declared, as Ragnar made to grab Osrith. But she was again too quick, and Ragnar hit one of Bloodair's men, sending him reeling into others. That caused the men to push the man back towards Ragnar, who hit him back, in the jaw. "Just, everyone, stop." It was Bryder's voice. "Listen, all of you, we are not one army if we choose to fight one another." Osrith had taken some steps backwards, but was now being held by the shoulders by two of Ragnar's men. "Get him, Ragnar!" one of them shouted, but instead of punching at Osrith, he took a burning log from the fire and burned her arm. She screamed, and tried to struggle, but the men holding Osrith's shoulders gave her no advantage. She waited, screwing up her eyes, for Ragnar to attack again, but it never came. Slowly, Osrith opened them. "A woman, Heston?" Ragnar asked. "I am no woman," Osrith declared, pain shooting up her left arm, her flesh throbbing from the burn. "Does anyone know this woman?" Ragnar asked the assembled Danes. "I would like to know her," someone shouted, causing a ripple of laughter. Beside a Dane far from Ragnar and close to Uhtred, Finan spied something. "Look here, Lord," he said, pointing to the handle of a blade in the belt of the Dane. He pointed to a straight line cut into the leather where at various points lines had been cut, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 or 4, sometimes these lines were one side of the main line, or the other. "So, it spells something," Finan told him, turning his head to check the other end of the line. "It spells nothing," Uhtred replied. "It's just decoration." But Finan had tapped the Dane on the shoulder. "What is your sword called?" Finan asked. The Dane, drawn from the entertainment before him, turned to Finan. "Nothing," he said, and looked back. "Not victory?" The Dane looked back to Finan. "Number." For the last time, Ragnar declared. "Does anyone claim this woman?" "Get her on her back," declared Heston, holding Osrith's forearm. She shook him away, angrily. "It's Osrith," Finan told Uhtred. His lord turned and gave him a frown. "It is not," he replied and shook his head to his friend. "You are obsessed, Finan. So why does that man have her sword?" But the deliberation got no further, and nor did Heston's insistence they shared Osrith, because another man stood before them. "Yes," Ethelwold said, standing in a way he thought was humble. "Though not well, she is a Gael, once in service to my uncle." He bowed superciliously, and offered his hand to Osrith. The two Danes holding her shoulders loosed her, and Osrith looked down to Ethelwald, and punched him in the face. This brought howls of laughter from the Danes, and Ragnar too. Osrith looked up at him, as he brought a hand to rest on her shoulder. "You are indeed a warrior," Ragnar declared. Then noticed something in her hand, which he took from her. At the same time, Finan had withdrawn Osrith's blade from the Dane's belt and had pushed past Tutard. "This is yours, is it not?" His question was in Gaelish, and Osrith stared into his face. "Take it," he declared, ignoring the commotion behind him, and Osrith grasped the hilt, her hand falling over Finan's fingers as he let go. As he stepped back, Finan's eyes caught the coin. "You recognize this?" Ragnar asked. Finan nodded. "Then she is indeed your woman?" Behind him, Ethelwald was getting to his feet. "Or the woman who is Edward's nursemaid," he put in, rubbing his face. "Tell me, does he suck hard on those tits of yours?" "May I kill him?" Finan asked Osrith. "Or do you want to do it?" Ragnar stepped between them. "Stand in the queue." Someone shouted. "There will be no more killing," he declared. "And if this Gale is known to you, do you claim her?" Finan stared at Osrith, who was looking back to him. "He is a friend to me," Osrith declared. "This is true, brother," Utad put in, stepping past Bryder. Osrith looked up at this unexpected defense from her brother, and the guilt of Gisela slid into place once more. "Yes," said Finan, quickly. Osrith shot him a look and saw that the corners of his mouth turned up a little, and he nodded his head. "I am her friend." "There we have it. No more entertainment tonight," Ragnar declared, and Osrith nodded a thanks to Finan, as she rescabarded Buey. "What was that?" Utad asked, as Finan joined them at the table with Ragnar. Bryder had crossed to where Osrith was still standing, and was talking to her. "Ogam," Finan replied. It was an ancient Irish script. The Druid used to use it on stone. The declaration. Utad asked, "Are you telling me you would let a woman be gang raped by these?" Finan made to choose his words carefully. "Danes." He leaned towards Utad, as Sifik and Osferth leaned towards him too, desperate not to miss any of Finan's explaining of himself. "You wouldn't, I know you." "Oh, they wouldn't have done that," Utad replied, airily. "Besides, she likes fighting." "She wouldn't have liked burning in a fire like those other poor souls," Finan retorted, drinking heavily from the jar that servants had begun to bring round. "Look," he added, "I don't like this, an army to march into Wessex. We have families there." At this point he looked at Sihtric, "And you have children there." "Bibbenberg," Finan declared. "Now that's a fight I can believe in." "Come." A hand on her shoulder made Osrith jump. It was the brown-haired woman who was with the warrior leader who had fought her. "You fought bravely." "It takes real courage to stand up to Ragnar." "Is he your husband?" Osrith asked, as she led her to a table. Bryder called one of the servants to her and gave her instructions to bring food. "I think what saved your life with Ragnar was that you are a Gael, not a Saxon," Bryder continued. "He fought in Earl on Canute too," she added, indicating a flame-haired Dane eating two fowl legs at once beside Ragnar. And a memory filtered into Osrith's brain. Did she know them? Had she faced them at Doia? It was likely. Ragnar was a very handsome man, and Canute ... She seemed to remember they were near one another. Blood heir. This Jarl Sigurd? Had he travelled to Irene to attempt an attack on a coastal monastery too? Ragnar always says how bravely the Irish fought him, not like the Saxons who run away, or fall to their knees and try to pray. How pathetic is that? Bryder bit into bread, pulled off a passing platter. Even the Welsh women fight back, and we faced a few of those people when we attacked Cael Gwilyd. Believe me. So, Bryder said, looking Osrith up and down. "Why are you in England?" Osrith shrugged her shoulders. "I was lost," Osrith replied. "I was going north, to begin my search for my family. Unfortunately, Wessex got its claws into me, and I had to work to earn silver." "I saw what you did to Ethelwald," Bryder remarked. "And you hate Wessex." "Winchester," Osrith corrected. "The backstabbing, the politics." Osrith drank deeply from the jar containing goat's milk. Behind them, there was a roar as someone won at dice. and tankards smashed together in celebration. You should try living with Danes. Bride replied, then you would know of political backstabbing. No. She tailed off, and her gaze fell to her husband. Osrith noticed, before coming back to her. No, they are honest, in their way, fair-minded to one another, not treacherous bastards undermining one another for personal gain like the Saxons. Brida smiled when she saw that Finan has caught Osrith's eye. And you intend to go north still? Osrith nodded. If she was indeed free to go, she had gained herself free passage almost to the border of Pitland. She watched Brida get to her feet and felt her cheeks flush as Finan crossed the straw-laden floor, sitting down next to her. Why are you here? He asked, urgently, reaching out a hand to Osrith's. I decided to come overland, Osrith remarked, waiting for his reaction. You never did. Finan exclaimed. What in the edget? I got lost, Osrith admitted. After I left you, I went south to Ethliad, and the mercen army. Oh, Finan replied, them. And I was given a mission. But I was too late to carry it out. Regarding the Lady Ethelfled, Osrith added, when Finan raised an eyebrow. And I heard what you said about Bibbenberg, Osrith continued, but Utad will need to go south. She leaned over the table, talking close to Finan's ear. Ethelfled is hiding for her life in a place called Winchelcombe. And yes, I wish to go north. Osrith, Finan declared, reaching for her hand. Then, he spied the burn on her arm and asked, does it hurt very much? It is cooling, Osrith replied, for Brida had supplied her with a cloth and clean water to bathe her arm. And north, that is where you want to be? Finan persisted. Osrith shook her head. I do not know, truly. I dare not say any place, Finan Moore, for when my heart is set on something, I lose it, Osrith admitted. From her shirt, Osrith pulled out the silver piece again and held it out towards Finan. But Finan shook his head. Look after it for me, he asked, folding his hand around Osrith's, then withdrawing it quickly when he saw Utad glaring at them disdainfully. And he has given up Benin but now he is a Dane, Osrith added, as if that was the topic they had just been discussing. Utad frowned, crossly. What do you know of Bibbenberg? He asked, scornfully. Wouldn't you like to know? Osrith thought, only what Finan has told me, that your birthright was usurped. Utad shot a look of outrage to his friend. Finan should learn to keep his mouth shut. Did he say anything else? Utad demanded of her. Wait for me in Wessex. But, since I will not get there before this army of Danes and Norse get there to destroy that kingdom, I do think that I have the best of the deal. You should have gone, Utad told her, scraping back the bench on which he was sitting. I'll do as I wish. Osrith returned, hotly. I hear you already do. Osrith looked up to Utad, who had his hands on his hips. Is your ass jealous of the amount of shit that's just come out of your mouth? She asked. Laughter came from behind Osrith, and Brida set a lump of bread onto Osrith's plate. This girl seems to know you well, Utad, she commented, as Utad raised eyebrows. I'll do as I wish, Osrith repeated, when Utad made to argue with her. Instead, it was Brida who had the next say. Stay here with us until the army marches, she said. You will come to no harm. But Utad had already gripped Osrith's forearm. And I say you'll do as Finan wishes, as he is your friend, and that is the only reason you are not being passed from Dane to Dane here. Brida leaned towards Finan. Is she staying? Brida asked him. No, she's going, said Osrith. At first light, I figure someone had all of my wealth, so we are quits, she said to Brida. North, she added. Lackland, are you? Brida asked, shaking her head. You can only be a Dane with a determination like that. Are you a Dane? Osrith asked her. I chose to be one. Like Utad. She bent close to Osrith's ear. Where does your heart lie? North, Osrith replied, in Danish. In Alba. As yours lies here. And she thanked Brida for the food, and Finan for his friendship, before making her way outside again. It was a few moments before she realized she was being followed. What is it that Utad has done to you? It was Brida, and she had followed Osrith outside. Many Danes were lying drunk from the night's entertainment. Some were throwing up, others asleep between bales of hay. legs sticking out. In the case of one inebriated Dane, Osrith waited for a moment to find a word that truly summed it up. "Got in my way," she said at last. "Then, you should go in fellowship, with Freya's blessing." Bryda touched her cheek. "No man should hump you, though you should be with your friend," she added. But Osrith shook her head. "And when the Morrigan comes to you," Osrith replied, "let her pick you up, and give you strength." She saw Bryda frown. "And who is the Morrigan? How far north have you been?" Osrith asked. "This far," Bryda told her. "When you get further north, your gods will retreat a little, for Alba is the land of the Scythe, the land spirits," Osrith added. "Like my god is there, yours will remain. But it is the Morrigan who shouts the loudest. But I am glad to see he is no longer close to death," Osrith told Bryda. And Bryda told her how she had blocked the powers of the seer, Skade, who had been poisoning his mind with the Nith's tongue. Bryda explained. "That's what it is," Osrith replied, intrigued. It looked as if it had an effect on her. "Yes. You must find somewhere safe to be," Bryda cautioned again. "I have seen how Ethelwold has been looking at you, and I think he is the one you have truly had problems with." Osrith nodded. It had been a shock to see Ethelwold, but there was no way in hell she was going to ask Uhted's permission to be with his men for her safety. In the end, when Bryda turned and followed Ragnar back into the hall, Osrith made her way to the cells. The guard was surprised when Osrith asked in Danish to be put back inside again, and he looked about, as if this was some sort of trick. But, eventually Osrith was back inside, and the lock clicked behind her.